Scary stories told in re-rain. Welcome. We're starting. Story number 1. The Uninvited Guest. A few years back, I booked a secluded cabin through Airbnb for a weekend getaway. It wasn't anything fancy, just a chance to escape the daily grind for a couple of days. The cabin was a 4-hour drive from my hometown, nestled in a remote area, with just a handful of other cabins scattered within a mile. The woods bordered the back porch, which was precisely what I was looking for. I arrived early in the morning, eager to explore the property and soak in the tranquility. The afternoon was spent relaxing on the back porch in a swinging chair, taking in the peaceful surroundings. As I gazed into the distance, I saw a man walking through the woods. He looked like an ordinary guy, likely a visitor at one of the nearby cabins. I watched him disappear further into the trees and continued enjoying the fresh air and sunshine. After spending an hour outside, I went inside to prepare dinner and settle in for a movie. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, which startled me. I hadn't even noticed there was a doorbell. Curiosity got the better of me, and I went to answer it. Standing on the porch was the man I had seen in the woods earlier. "Can I help you?" I asked. He flashed a broad smile. "I've been lost in the woods for hours. Could you help me find my way back to my cabin?" I hesitated. There was something about him that felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "Sure, let me grab my phone so you can look up the address," I said. I closed the door and went to retrieve my phone from the couch. When I returned and opened the door again, he was gone. He wasn't on the porch or anywhere in the front yard. I searched the area, confused, before closing the door and returning to the couch. There was definitely something strange about him, but his sudden vanishing made no sense. I stayed alert for a while, but eventually, exhaustion took over and I went to bed. Surprisingly, I slept soundly that night. The next morning, I stepped out onto the back porch to enjoy my coffee. 10 minutes later, I saw something that made my heart leap into my throat. The man from the night before was back, walking through the woods in the same area I had seen him the previous day. He seemed to be following the same path. It was clear now. He wasn't lost. But why had he come to my cabin? Unnerved, I went back inside and called a friend, sharing my strange experience. It was a relief to talk to someone about my confusion. As we were speaking, the doorbell rang, sending a fresh wave of fear through me. "Do you need something?" I asked cautiously, opening the door a crack. He flashed that same unnerving smile and repeated his story about being lost and needing directions. I stared back at him, feeling a mix of annoyance and confusion. "Can you grab your phone so I can look up the address?" he repeated. A chill shot down my spine. He had said the exact same thing the night before. I slammed the door shut and told my friend what was happening. She urged me to leave immediately. I agreed and quickly packed my things. Before heading to my car, I checked the peephole to make sure the man was gone. After throwing my bags in the back seat, I got in and started to back out of the driveway. That's when I saw him. He was standing in the front window, inside the cabin, watching me drive away. I contacted the Airbnb owner as soon as I got home and told him about the man and his bizarre behavior. His response was short and dismissive. He didn't seem the least bit concerned, simply offering a brief apology for my unpleasant experience. To this day, I still have no idea what that man was trying to do, but the entire encounter was incredibly unsettling. And the image of him standing inside the cabin, watching me leave, still gives me chills. Story number 2. The Unseen Presence. I'm 29 years old and live close to the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. I've been backpacking and camping for years, exploring the many trails in the region. My best friend, who lives nearby, often joins me on these adventures. Each fall, we typically choose a challenging trail for a multi-day backpacking trip, lasting anywhere from a few days to a full week. In 2019, we planned a hike across the mountain range to a remote, secluded lake. However, just a few days before our trip, my friend had to cancel due to a work emergency. I had already taken the whole week off and had everything packed, so I decided to go alone. Early Monday morning, I arrived at the trailhead and started my hike. This wasn't a typical recreational trail. Backpacking trails are often unmarked, requiring careful navigation with maps, compasses, and landmarks. You generally hike towards a prominent landmark, like a unique rock formation, and once you reach it, you can identify the next landmark to guide you. I spent the first 2 days hiking towards a ridge in the mountains. As darkness fell on the second day, I set up camp, still several hours from the ridge. I pitched my tent, built a fire, and warmed up some food. The sun had set, and it was around 8 p.m. when I finally settled into my tent to read. I left the fire burning, planning to extinguish it later before going to sleep. About 20 minutes later, as I was reading, I heard a loud snap, like a branch breaking, directly behind my tent. I sat up straight, my heart pounding. My first thought was a black bear, attracted by the smell of my cooking. But I didn't hear anything else. I crawled out of the tent, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing. I yelled loudly, hoping to scare off any potential predators. Silence. It was incredibly unnerving. The sound of that snapping branch had been so distinct, as if someone had stepped on it. I stayed outside my tent for a while, scanning the surrounding woods before putting out the fire and retreating inside. Sleep was elusive that night. I was on high alert, listening for any sign of movement outside. To my surprise, I managed to sleep through the night. The next morning, I packed up my gear and continued my hike. I reached the ridge by midday, and from there, it was a direct route to the lake. I pushed myself hard, hoping to arrive before sunset so I wouldn't have to relocate my campsite. I made it with about an hour of daylight left. The lake was stunning, definitely worth the challenging hike. I spent some time enjoying the view before setting up camp near the tree line, beside the lake. As I sat by the fire that evening, I kept hearing soft noises coming from the trees behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sounds were distinctly like footsteps. I knew no one else was up there. I would have seen their campsite when I explored the area. It was too dark by this point to see more than a few feet, so visually searching for the source of the sounds was impossible. An hour later, I retreated to my tent, but every few minutes, I'd hear those soft footsteps again. They were so faint that it was hard to tell for sure what they were, but they kept me on edge. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted off to sleep. What felt like only an hour later, I woke with a start to the sound of someone running away from my tent. I scrambled out, grabbing my flashlight, and shone it towards the sound of retreating footsteps. I caught a fleeting glimpse of a figure disappearing into the distance. My heart pounded in my chest. Looking around my tent, I saw footprints everywhere. Someone had been walking all around my campsite, circling my tent. I quickly rebuilt my fire, desperate for light and a sense of security. I was terrified, completely alone, with nowhere to go. I sat by the fire all night, constantly scanning the darkness, listening for any sign of movement, but I saw and heard nothing else. The next morning, after snapping a few photos of the lake, I packed up and started the long trek back. I had planned to stay longer, but I was no longer comfortable. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the shadows, was overwhelming. Thankfully, I made it back without further incident. However, along the way, I noticed that several small items were missing from my backpack: food, tools, small essentials. I had kept my backpack with me the entire time, so how could this be possible? To this day, I wonder if whoever was outside my tent that night had somehow managed to sneak inside and steal from my bag while I was asleep. The thought still sends chills down my spine. Story number 3. The Storm's Shadow. My roommate was away for the week, leaving me alone in our house. It was spring break, and my college classes were on hold. I had no plans and nothing pressing to do. A powerful storm swept through our city, trapping me inside. This was a typical occurrence for that time of year, but each storm seemed worse than the last. The wind howled, the trees swayed precariously, and the house creaked and groaned. Knowing sleep would be impossible, I decided to stay up and play video games. I spent the next hour immersed in my Xbox, ignoring the raging storm outside. Around 11 p.m., the doorbell rang, startling me. Who would be out in this weather? I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. I couldn't see anyone. I opened the door, and a blast of wind and rain hit me in the face, but there was no one there. I figured the wind must have triggered the doorbell and went back to my game. A few minutes later, I heard a loud crash coming from the backyard. It was our patio furniture tumbling and breaking in the wind. I rushed to the back door and found everything scattered across the yard, being tossed about by the gusts. I quickly put on my shoes and ventured out into the storm, determined to secure the furniture. The wind was so strong it stung my face, but I pushed on, gathering the chairs and tables and piling them against the back of the house. As I struggled to wrangle the last piece of furniture, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the yard, watching me. I glanced at them, then grabbed the furniture and rushed back inside, seeking refuge from the downpour. When I looked out the back door, the person was gone. Between the mysterious visitor and the phantom doorbell ring earlier, I was beginning to feel uneasy. I went back to the living room and tried to distract myself with my phone, but I was on edge. After a while, my exhaustion caught up with me. I grabbed a blanket and lay down on the couch. The storm seemed louder upstairs, and I wasn't up for the trek to my bedroom. It took a while, but eventually, I drifted off to sleep. Hours later, a violent gust of wind rattled the house, jerking me awake. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. My feet touched the floor, and they were soaking wet. I looked down and saw a puddle of water next to the couch. Then I noticed more puddles, forming a trail across the living room floor. Inside the puddles were faint, muddy footprints. My heart pounding in my chest, I scrambled to my feet and retreated to a corner of the room. I stood there for a minute, listening intently. The wind howled outside, but I didn't hear anything else. Cautiously, I followed the trail of footprints. They led all through the house, upstairs and down. It was clear they had entered through the back door, which I had foolishly forgotten to lock in my haste to get out of the rain. I locked the door and grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, but a terrifying thought stopped me. What if they were still inside? I crept back to my hiding spot and quietly placed the call. I waited in silence for the police to arrive. The officers searched the house, but they couldn't find anyone. They noted the footprints and the unlocked back door. They concluded that it was likely a personal attack, as nothing seemed to be missing, and whoever it was had clearly targeted my house specifically. They also pointed out the most disturbing detail. Whoever it was had been standing over me while I was sleeping. They hadn't harmed me, just watched me. It was incredibly creepy and made no sense. If they had intended to hurt me, they could have easily done so while I was unconscious. After the police left, I started piecing things together. I realized that whoever had broken in was probably looking for my roommate. They had seen me, searched the house, and left when they realized my roommate wasn't home. If my roommate had been there that night, things might have turned out very differently. Story number 4. The Vandal's Fury. I was house-sitting for my best friend last year while they were away on a 2-week business trip. They had a few lizards, some fish, and a lot of plants that needed care. Their house was much nicer than my tiny apartment, so I was happy to help out. The first week went by without any problems. It was like a mini vacation. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, I heard someone cough just outside the back door. The sound was so close, it made me jump. I hurried to the back door and switched on the outdoor lights, hoping to scare off whoever was lurking out there. I waited a minute, then cautiously peered out the window. There was no one there. I was bewildered. Why would someone be hanging around my back door? I remained on high alert for the rest of the evening. Later that night, feeling hungry, I decided to go out for food. As I was leaving, I noticed a set of footprints in the yard. The grass was flattened, forming a clear path. I followed the footprints. They led from the sidewalk to the back of the house, then back to the sidewalk. I couldn't figure it out. It seemed pointless. When I returned from getting food, I checked for more footprints, but found none. I went back inside, feeling unsettled, and tried to relax by watching TV. After about an hour, I started getting sleepy and went to bed. I scrolled through my phone for a while before drifting off to sleep. Sometime later, I was awakened by the sound of someone walking around in the front yard. I listened intently as they approached the front door, then continued around the house to the back. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, as I heard the back door rattling. Someone was trying to get in. I crept to the top of the stairs and flipped on the downstairs lights. The sound stopped. I inched down a few steps and peered over the railing toward the back door. No one was there. The silence was somehow more terrifying than the sounds of someone trying to break in. Moments later, I heard the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. Shards of glass from the living room window flew across the room. I couldn't see what was happening, but I knew someone had just broken in. I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom. I heard heavy footsteps and more crashing sounds as the intruder moved through the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, praying they'd arrive in time. The intruder's rampage continued. They seemed to be destroying everything in their path, knocking over furniture, smashing objects, breaking things. Then I heard them thundering up the stairs. They tried my bedroom door, but it was locked. Undeterred, they began smashing against the door, trying to break it down. One of the door panels splintered, and I heard them reaching in, fumbling with the lock. Then the door flew open. A man stormed into the room, his face hidden behind a mask and a hoodie. He was wielding a metal baseball bat. I cowered in a corner, holding back tears as he stared at me with fury in his eyes. Then, to my surprise, he looked away and proceeded to demolish my bedroom. He smashed the furniture, punched holes in the walls, completely destroying the room in a matter of minutes. Then he stormed out, leaving me trembling in the wreckage. I stayed huddled in that corner, paralyzed with fear, until the police arrived. My friend cut their trip short and rushed home to deal with the aftermath. The house was completely trashed, but nothing was stolen. The police were baffled. They concluded that it must have been a personal attack, someone who knew my friend and held a grudge against them. But my friend couldn't imagine who would do such a thing. I tried to describe the intruder, but he had been completely masked, so I wasn't much help. The most terrifying thing was that he had ignored me completely. It was as if I was invisible to him. It made me realize that if my friend had been home, the situation would have been much, much worse. Story number 5. The Gas Station Ambush. Last year, I was working the night shift at a gas station, which I know is a classic setting for creepy stories. But when you're actually working there, you never really expect anything to happen. It was a rainy night, not pouring, but enough to make being outside unpleasant. In weather like this, we didn't get many customers, so it was a pretty slow night. I passed the time scrolling through social media on my phone. Suddenly, I heard a tapping sound coming from the front door. I looked up and saw a man standing outside in the rain. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket. I waved, indicating that he could come in. The door was unlocked. But he continued tapping on the glass as if he didn't see me. I walked over and opened the door, greeting him. He didn't acknowledge me, just walked past and straight to the counter. I thought it was kind of funny how oblivious he seemed. "Can I help you?" I asked. He grunted and asked for a pack of cigarettes. He paid with cash, grabbed the cigarettes, and walked out. As he left, I noticed something strange. There were no cars in the parking lot or at the gas pumps. The man walked down the road, disappearing into the rainy darkness. I was confused. If he didn't have a car, why come to a gas station? Why not just buy cigarettes at a regular store? The strangeness of the encounter stayed with me. It just didn't make sense. About an hour later, I was stocking shelves when I heard that same tapping sound at the door. It was the same man. "Are you okay?" I asked, opening the door. He didn't answer. "You can use the phone if you need to," I offered. "Down the road," he muttered, pointing towards the gas pumps. He gestured to a gas can sitting beside one of the pumps and said, "Help." I realized then that he probably didn't speak much English. "Sure," I said. I walked up to the pump with him. He handed me a credit card, and I started filling the gas can. The man stood behind me, keeping his distance, which made me uncomfortable. When the gas can was full, I handed it back to him and turned to go inside. He grabbed my arm, stopping me. He started speaking rapidly, but I couldn't understand a word. I pulled away and headed back towards the store. He yelled something, as if calling out to someone else. As I reached the door, I saw another man behind the counter, shoving merchandise into a backpack. Our eyes met, and he vaulted over the counter. The next thing I knew, everything went black. I woke up on the floor, my head throbbing. I immediately realized what had happened. The man at the pump had hit me to help his accomplice escape. I called the police, and they took me to the hospital. Thankfully, I only had a concussion and a few stitches. The worst part was the humiliation of being so easily tricked. But in retrospect, I'm grateful I blacked out. The security footage showed that the man inside the store had been carrying a gun. If I had tried to stop them, things could have been much worse. Story number 6. The Unwanted Visitors. I'm a 31-year-old woman. This happened back in 2020 when I was 29. My friend, Stacy, told me that her friend, Brianne, needed a dog sitter while she and her husband were on vacation in California. Stacy knew I sometimes dog sat through the Rover app, which connects pet owners with sitters and walkers. I needed some extra cash, and $200 for 5 days of dog sitting seemed like easy money. Brian gave me a tour of her house and introduced me to their massive husky bear. He was a big, lovable dog, maybe a little overweight, but adorable nonetheless. Brian told me I could help myself to any food in the house. The front door had a keypad lock, which made me feel secure. A week later, I arrived at their house on a Friday night, shortly after Brian and her husband left for California. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent most of my time at work, coming home during breaks to feed Bear and take him for walks. At night, we'd relax, watch movies, and he'd sleep next to me on the couch. On Monday night, after I got home from work, I heard a knock at the door. I looked through the peephole and saw a man wearing what looked like a black police uniform. I was a little hesitant, but opened the door slightly. "Hello, I'm looking for George," he said. "George?" I thought. There's no George here. I'm just dog sitting. I've been here since Friday. Now that I think about it, it was really stupid to tell a stranger at the door that I was alone. "Oh, okay. How long are you here for?" he asked. "Until Wednesday," I replied. "Cool. All right. Sorry to bother you." He turned and walked away. The encounter left me feeling uneasy, and I double-checked that the door was locked. I texted Bran about it, but she brushed it off, telling me not to worry. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, though. Things were quiet until Wednesday night. As I was lying in bed, I suddenly felt the need to make sure the front door was locked. I got up and checked. It was, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling of unease. I eventually fell asleep, but around 3:05 a.m., I was awakened by Bear's frantic barking. I sat up, heart pounding, convinced that someone was breaking in. I rushed to the living room and found Bear growling and barking at the front door. Peering through the peephole, I saw the same man from Monday night, now accompanied by another man. This time, they were both wearing security guard uniforms. I was terrified. Why would they come back, knowing I was alone? And why were they dressed like security guards at 3 in the morning? I stayed silent and made sure all the doors were locked. After a while, I heard them leave. I cautiously opened the door, but didn't see any sign of a security vehicle. I suspect Bear's barking scared them away, and I was so grateful for his protection. I didn't tell Brienne about the second encounter. She was already in California, and I didn't want to worry her. I'm just glad I only had one more night at that house. I still have no idea who those men were or what they wanted, but the whole experience was extremely creepy, and I haven't dog-sat since. Story number 7. The Motel Menace. Last year, I decided to embark on a long 10-day road trip. I didn't have any particular destination in mind, just planned to drive in a large loop, stopping at various cities along the way. I hadn't booked any hotels in advance, figuring I could find vacancies as I traveled. For the first 5 nights, finding available rooms was a breeze. But on the 6th night, I ran into some trouble. I was driving between cities, and by 11 p.m., I was exhausted. I wanted to push through to the next major city and sleep in my car somewhere safe, but I was too tired to drive any further. I pulled over and called every major hotel chain along my route, but they were all fully booked, with no vacancies for walk-ins. The thought of sleeping in my car on the side of the road was terrifying, but I was running out of options. Just as I was about to give up, I saw a sign for a motel about 10 miles ahead. I drove until I reached it and pulled into the mostly empty parking lot. The motel was a small, single-story building. I went inside and asked the woman at the front desk if they had any vacancies. To my relief, they did, and she handed me a key card. The room was a bit outdated, but the price was right. I had been in the room for barely a minute when I heard a knock on the door. I cautiously opened it a crack to see who it was. A man stood there, mumbling incoherently to himself. The moment he saw the door open, he tried to shove his way in, his rambling growing more intense. I reacted quickly, putting my arm out to block him. He stopped talking and stared at me, wild-eyed. I told him firmly to leave. He hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked away. I watched him go, then bolted the door. It was a bizarre encounter, but I wasn't too concerned. I figured he was just some harmless, disoriented guy. About 15 minutes later, I went to bed. However, a few hours into the night, I was awakened by another knock on the door. I groaned. It had to be that same guy again. This time, I was prepared. I put the chain lock on before opening the door a crack. The moment the lock disengaged, the man slammed into the door with full force, shouting gibberish. I jumped back and immediately dialed 911. He continued to ram the door, screaming nonsensically, trying desperately to break in. Then, to my horror, I saw a knife blade appear between the door and the frame. He was trying to cut the chain. The chain was far too thick for a knife to cut through, but the sight of that blade terrified me. The man's frantic attack continued for several minutes before suddenly stopping. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. I had no idea what was wrong with him or why he was so determined to get into my room, but it was clear he had bad intentions. Maybe he was high on something, but it was still terrifying. I realized how easily I could have been hurt if I hadn't been cautious. The whole experience left me feeling shaken. Even though I don't think I was personally targeted, it's unsettling to think that someone out there might be watching me. Story number 8. The Neighbor's Gaze. I moved across the state into a newly built house last year. My previous landlord had decided to sell his property, forcing me to find a new place. I was really excited about this new house. However, almost as soon as I moved in, I noticed something unsettling. My neighbor across the street was constantly staring at me. It was a middle-aged man, and he seemed to be always lurking around his house. At first, I tried to ignore it, assuming he was simply curious about the new person in the neighborhood. But his constant staring became increasingly creepy. He never spoke to anyone, never smiled, never seemed to leave his house. He just watched. I would catch him peering at my house from his driveway at all hours of the night. It was starting to freak me out. One night, I was getting ready for bed when I heard a scraping sound outside my window. I peeked out and saw my neighbor dragging a large ladder across his yard. It was late, and I couldn't imagine why he would be doing any work on his house at that hour. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I saw him again, standing at the end of my driveway, staring at me through my window. I quickly closed the curtains, trying to block him out, but the feeling of being watched sent chills down my spine. I didn't like him being near my driveway, so I hurried to my car and drove off. He was back in his yard, watching me as I pulled out of the driveway. Things got worse. One night, I could have sworn I heard someone walking through the grass in my fenced-in backyard. I got up and looked out the window, but the sound stopped. I waited for a while, listening intently, but I didn't hear anything else. Just to be safe, I checked the window one last time. That's when I saw him, standing in the darkness at the far end of my yard. It was too dark to make out any features, but there was definitely someone there watching me. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. I told them about my creepy neighbor and how unsafe I felt, but they said there was nothing they could do unless he actually did something illegal. I started taking precautions, locking my doors and windows, avoiding going outside alone. But even inside my own house, I didn't feel safe. After 2 weeks of living in constant fear, I even considered breaking my lease. Then things escalated to a terrifying new level. One night, I came home late from work and went straight to bed. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud thud against the side of the house. It sounded like it was right outside my second-story bedroom window. My heart pounded as I slowly got out of bed and approached the window. I peeked through the curtains and screamed. There, inches from my window, was my neighbor's face. He was standing on a ladder, trying to look into my bedroom. He scrambled down a ladder and ran as soon as he realized I'd seen him. I immediately called the police, and this time, they caught him trying to get away with the ladder. While he didn't admit to anything, it was pretty obvious what he had been doing. Later, another neighbor told me that they had also had some strange encounters with this guy, including catching him peering into their windows. I wish they had reported him sooner. Maybe it would have prevented what happened to me. Story number 9. The Locked Room. I lived with my older brother for about 4 years after high school graduation. We shared apartment rent, since neither of us could afford anything on our own. But during the 4th year, my brother started making more money and planned to move when the lease was up. I wasn't making much money, so I knew I couldn't afford to pay rent on my own. I looked for a roommate online for a few months, but decided to just move too and find a cheaper place to live. I searched until the last month of our apartment lease. My brother had already pretty much moved everything out, and I was under a lot of pressure to find a place to live quickly. But with my extremely low budget, it wasn't easy. Eventually, I came across an ad posted by a landlord who was renting out a room in his house. The man's name was Evan. I sent him a message to let him know I was interested, and then continued my search. A few minutes later, he responded. We set up a time to call later that day, and when we called, he explained all the details. He said he lived alone in the house and was renting out his spare bedroom, but I would be able to use all the other rooms in the house. That sounded great, so I agreed. A couple weeks later, I loaded all my stuff into the U-Haul and drove to the house. We had texted and called during this time, and he had sent me a bunch of pictures of the house, but I hadn't had a chance to see it in person yet. I arrived around noon, parking in the driveway. The house was definitely small, but it looked nice from the outside. Evan was standing in the garage and waved me over. He quickly showed me around the house and then helped me unload all my stuff into my room. Evan seemed like a normal man in his early 30s, 10 years older than me, but I didn't really care. He wasn't very good at keeping a conversation going though, and was a little shy. Anyway, we finished moving everything inside and I left for the U-Haul. I ordered a cab back to the house and by then it was almost 8 p.m. and I was really tired. Evan was sitting on the couch watching TV, so I told him I was going to go to bed early and headed to my room. Overall, it seemed like a decent place and I was happy with it. I did some more unpacking, set up my bed, and by 9 p.m. I was finally ready for bed. I went to my door to lock it and turn off the light, but when I reached out, I saw that there was no lock on the doorknob. That is, there was no lock at all. Confused, I opened the door. The lock was on the outside of the door. I walked into the living room and asked Evan why the bedroom door was locked from the outside. He looked confused and said he never noticed it, but he would change the lock tomorrow. I shrugged and said okay and went back to my room. I was tired and wasn't too worried about it, but it was definitely a strange discovery. I got into bed and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I heard someone walking around the kitchen and assumed it was just Evan going to get water or something, so I closed my eyes again. After a minute, I heard him walking back down the hallway, but as he passed my room, he stopped. I opened my eyes and looked at the door. He stood there quietly for maybe 15 seconds before I heard a click. He had locked my door. My stomach dropped and I felt my face go cold as Evan went to his room. As soon as I heard his bedroom door shut, I quietly stood up and walked over to the door. I tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I stood there in shock for a few seconds, realizing that this man I had just met had locked me in my room. My fear began to turn to anger. I called out to Evan to open the door. It only took a second before I heard Evan run out of his room and come to my door. I heard him put his hand on the door, but he paused for a few seconds before unlocking it. I immediately swung the door open. "What was that?" I asked him. Evan hesitated and said he just wanted to make sure he was safe because he didn't know me. I understood his concerns, but locking someone in a room wasn't the smartest way to accomplish that. I told him I'd pack up and leave in the morning, and sat on the living room couch all night waiting for the U-Haul rental to open. At 9 in the morning, I peeked into the hallway, and Evan's bedroom door was still closed, which hopefully meant he was still asleep. I then went straight there and drove the U-Haul back to the house. When I walked in, Evan's bedroom door was open. "Evan," I called out. Story number 10. The Midnight Intruder. I worked the night shift as a receptionist at a small, local hotel. My duties include checking guests in, answering phones, and monitoring the security cameras. It's usually a calm job, as we're not a large or particularly busy establishment. On this particular night, the hotel was nearly empty. Only a handful of guests were registered. I was at the front desk, using my phone, when I saw a man approach the entrance. I stood and greeted him as he entered. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked clearly intoxicated. He stated, "I need a room for the night." While he appeared to be under the influence of something, we typically accept walk-in bookings when occupancy is below 75%, so I processed his check-in and handed him a key. He headed towards the elevators, and I resumed my previous tasks. A few hours later, I heard a loud thumping sound emanating from the hallway, a sound like someone was aggressively trying to open a door. I investigated and found the man I'd checked in earlier attempting to force open one of our maintenance closets. "Can I help you find something?" I asked. He looked at me with unsettling eyes, made another attempt to open the door, but then just stared blankly at me. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Perhaps his intoxication had made him disoriented, looking for the vending machine, I don't know. I didn't want to provoke him, so I returned to my desk and dismissed the incident. A significant amount of time passed without incident. It was around 3:00 a.m. when I decided to do a quick patrol of the ground floor to stay alert and occupied. As I reached the hallway near the reception desk, I heard a sudden violent banging coming from one of the rooms. I paused, listening, then proceeded upstairs to the second floor, where I believed the noise originated. The hallway was now silent, which made me uneasy. I walked down the hall, hearing nothing, until I reached the end, where I discovered one of the room doors ajar. After pausing briefly, I knocked gently. There was no response. Hesitantly, I peered inside. The room appeared empty. I wasn't comfortable entering fully, so I couldn't thoroughly search the room, but I was certain nobody was present. I closed the door and noted the room number, 112. That was the room I'd assigned to the man. I hadn't seen him leave the building. I quickly returned to the front desk and reviewed the security footage from the lobby and outside areas, but there was no sign of him. Suddenly, the hotel phone rang. A woman was on the line, reporting a man knocking loudly on her door in the middle of the night. I apologized and assured her I would address the situation. I hung up, taking a deep breath. I was becoming increasingly anxious. As I turned back to my desk, the phone rang again. This time, it was another guest, reporting the same thing, a man persistently knocking on their door. I immediately called the police. I remained near the entrance until they arrived, prepared to make a quick exit if necessary. Fortunately, they arrived before anything further transpired. However, they didn't find the man. Instead, they discovered a broken window in his room, indicating he likely escaped that way, quite a feat from a second-story window. Later, while the police were still investigating, a report came in. The car the man used to pay for the room was stolen. It remains unclear what his intentions were or why he was knocking on guest room doors. I'm profoundly grateful none of the guests opened their doors. The situation could have been far worse. Story number 11. The Unwelcome Visitor. A couple years ago, I moved into a new rented house. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, bought new furniture, and arranged everything to my liking. The main reason for the move was a new work-from-home job, so I needed a quiet and peaceful workspace. The house was quite secluded and had the peaceful environment I craved. One morning, after eating breakfast and starting work, there was a knock on my front door. It was my landlord. He smiled and asked how I was settling in. "Fine, thank you," I replied, not realizing why he had come. We exchanged pleasantries, after which he explained that he was just checking up on me. Then he left. This struck me as odd. While I appreciated the friendly gesture, a simple text message would have sufficed for me. I brushed it off and continued working. Later that evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The houses stood far apart, so I couldn't get a good look at the other houses. After walking around for about 30 minutes, I started to get ready to go home. As I turned the corner onto my street, I noticed a car parked on the curb. It wasn't right in front of my house, but there were no other houses nearby. As I approached, I recognized it as my landlord's car, the same one he had driven when he showed me the lot, but it was empty. I hurried to my house, checking the windows and yard for his presence, but he was nowhere to be seen. Although I wasn't frightened, I felt distinctly uneasy and anxious about the situation. I walked around the entire block and couldn't imagine where else he could be but my house. After a while, I stopped searching. About an hour later, there was another knock on my door. Looking through the peephole, I saw my master again. Opening the door, I sighed in annoyance. He smiled again and inquired about my well-being. "I'm fine, thank you," I replied, trying to be polite but firm. "Please let me know in advance if you plan to visit in the future." He apologized, stating that he just wanted to make sure I was happy with the house. I replied that I had work to do and closed the door. Something about that interaction, his tone and his gaze, was deeply unsettling to me. It wasn't just a lack of social awareness. He just made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. That evening, I pondered how best to let him know I needed privacy. He was my landlord. Technically, it was his property, but there were clear rules that landlords had to abide by. I eventually fell asleep, still unsure of how to proceed. I didn't sleep for long, however. It was past midnight when I was awakened by a knock. I turned on a light and walked down the stairs, angry at the possibility of another uninvited visit from the landlord. I looked through the peephole, and there he was. I swung the door open. "What are you doing here? You can't just show up like this. You have to leave," I demanded, barely containing my anger. He had a duffel bag in his hands. He claimed that the plumbing in the basement needed urgent repair, and the alarm on his phone signaled a small gas leak. This seemed suspicious since none of the alarms in the house went off. I told him I would call a professional in the morning and started to close the door, but he forcefully pushed his way in, pretending not to notice my attempt to close the door. Stunned, I just watched him. He smiled and said, "It will only take a minute." He set down his bag and asked me to come with him to the basement to inspect the suspected leak. He opened the door to the basement and started down, and I hesitated before following him. After a few steps down, it dawned on me, "Wait, I'll get my phone so I can take pictures of the problem." "I'll be right back," I said and quickly removed myself. Luckily, he stayed in the basement. I rushed to my room, grabbed my phone and keys, and rushed to the front door. But before I left, I cautiously walked over to the duffel bag and opened it. There were no tools in it, at least none that looked in any way familiar to me. I didn't recognize them, and there was no time to examine them closely. When I heard him coming back, I ran to my car and left immediately. From the nearest parking lot, I called the police. The aftermath of this still haunts me to this day. The police arrived and found that the homeowner was still in the house and the duffel bag was gone. They were never able to find it. In the end, the only result was that I was allowed to vacate the apartment without penalty. His unauthorized visits and creepy behavior were not enough to make a case. I accepted the offer and moved out immediately, but the constant fear that he might target someone else and do what he planned to do to me never left me. Story number 12. A Summer of Fear. Summer had just begun, and I, at 18, was free from the confines of school. With no job to occupy my time, I found myself adrift in the quiet comfort of home, spending my days lost in video games, YouTube, or simply relaxing. My parents were away for a few days, leaving me the temporary caretaker of their house. This wasn't unusual, and I never gave it much thought. Occasionally, I'd have friends over, but this particular night, I was relishing the solitude. As I sat engrossed in a rerun of one of my favorite shows on Netflix, my phone buzzing with notifications in my hand, a knock at the front door startled me. It was late, maybe 11 or 12. I paused the show, my heart a sudden drum against my ribs. It was so late. The realization dawned on me only after a moment of stunned silence, thankfully preventing me from carelessly opening the door. Looking through the peephole, I saw two men, their figures indistinguishable in their matching dark clothing, waiting with an unsettling stillness. Hesitantly, I stood there, debating whether to acknowledge their presence, to ask what they wanted. But I chose silence, simply watching them. A few seconds stretched into an eternity. One of them finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "Hello, we're here to see Mr. and Mrs. Hyan." They were talking about my parents, of course, though I had substituted their real names in my mind for a sense of privacy. Confused, I remained silent. It was far too late for any sort of visit, even an urgent one. After a brief, silent exchange, the men turned and walked away. The outdoor lights were off, so I couldn't see where they went, and I never saw any headlights or car lights. The thought that they might have walked all that distance, which made the whole situation even stranger, sent a shiver down my spine. I went back to my show, but left it on pause, my ears straining for any sound. I didn't have to wait long. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed up to the porch. But instead of knocking again, they began making their way around the side of the house. My heart pounded in my chest. I sprang from the couch, racing to the back window. As they entered the backyard, I saw them push open the fence, their movements silent but menacing. I crouched low, hidden from view, but close enough to hear their hushed voices. They were headed towards the back door now, their hands fumbling with the lock. This was it. This was my chance. I grabbed my phone and scrambled into the garage. Dialing 911, I breathlessly explained the situation. Less than a minute later, a deafening pop reverberated through the house, and the back door flew open. I heard their footsteps, heavy and purposeful, moving through the house and straight to the stairs leading up to the bedrooms. A door slammed shut. Then, silence. 10 minutes, each one filled with the agonizing thud of my heart, passed before I heard the distant wail of sirens. They grew louder, closer, until finally, the police cars pulled up to the house. As they arrived, I heard a flurry of hurried footsteps upstairs, followed by the sound of two men arguing. Several officers rushed through the back door and up the stairs. One of them came to the garage, leading me outside. The men were apprehended, but they remained uncommunicative, refusing to explain their actions. Weeks passed, and it became increasingly clear that they weren't simply trying to rob the house. The only charge that could be brought against them was breaking and entering. But the chilling truth was far more disturbing. They seemed to be looking for my parents. It felt as though they were waiting for them upstairs, intending to confront them upon their return. I often wondered if I should have shown myself, if that would have prevented them from breaking in. But something in their demeanor, their unsettling silence and purpose, made me doubt that anything would have stopped them. I believed, with an unsettling certainty, that they would have done whatever they had planned, regardless of my presence. The fear that gnawed at me, that icy dread, stemmed from the knowledge that their motives were a mystery, their intentions a terrifying unknown. Story number 13. A home on the edge. My home sits on the edge of a mid-sized town in Wyoming. The vast, open spaces of this state are what drew me here. Owning a large plot of land is more attainable here than in most other places. My house is modest, but it provided the cozy solitude I craved. This incident happened 4 years ago, back in 2019. Spring had sprung, but with it came an unrelenting deluge of rain, seemingly endless for a month. It was a Sunday, and I was home from work, enjoying a day of relaxation and television. Around 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock p.m., an unexpected knock at the door startled me. The sound was barely audible over the relentless rain. I opened the door, surprised to find a stranger standing there, not a mailman or any other familiar face. It was unusual to see someone so far out on my property, considering its remote location. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man, who appeared to be in his late 20s, explained that he had been camping in the nearby woods and had encountered some trouble. He needed a place to stay for the night. Given my house's proximity to the woods, his story seemed plausible. I was the closest residence by at least 5 or 6 miles. The relentless rain only intensified my sympathy for his situation, but it couldn't erase the inherent danger of inviting a stranger into my home. I offered him a phone call to arrange a ride into town, but he declined, abruptly stating that he couldn't stay. He turned and left. I watched him walk down the dirt road, then disappear into the woods. The odd encounter quickly faded from my mind, and I returned to my television program. Hours later, well into the night, an orange glow caught my eye. It was emanating from the window overlooking my backyard. I rose and parted the curtains. Through the heavy rain and fog, I saw a small campfire burning in the middle of the woods behind my house. It flickered beneath a large tree, barely visible through the downpour. Standing next to it was a figure, their outline obscured by the distance and the weather. I couldn't make out if they were facing my house or the woods. After a brief moment of observation, I closed the curtains and grabbed my phone. I called the police, reporting the presence of this individual on my property. I knew it would take at least an hour for them to arrive, and I wasn't in immediate danger, but I wanted them gone before I went to bed. After ending the call, I checked the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure was gone. Then, I heard footsteps approaching my house. I quickly moved to another window and saw him walking past, a hunting rifle clutched in his hand. He turned the corner and headed toward the front door. He banged on it a few times, then fell silent. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my self-defense handgun from the hallway closet and moved to the wall, trying to make sense of the situation. He slammed on the door again, this time with the butt of the rifle, nearly breaking a panel. Fear propelled me into action. I knew I had to deter him before things escalated. I fired a shot towards the edge of the door frame, the deafening roar of the gunshot filling the house. When my hearing returned, all I could hear was the sound of the rain. No more banging, shouting, or footsteps. After 5 tense minutes of silence, I gathered the courage to peek through the peephole. The porch was empty, but clear footprints led away from the house. He must have run after my shot. While my hearing was gone, the police had arrived and conducted a thorough search of the area. They found strange details near the campfire: a duffel bag, partially buried in the ground, likely dug up just hours before the attack. They explained that it was probably a burglary kit, or possibly even a kit designed for a more serious crime, planted in advance and retrieved for use that night. It meant the man who attacked me had planned this, and had been on my property before that night. Why he chose me, and who he is, or where he is now, remains a mystery. The police investigation yielded no leads, leaving me no closer to answers 4 years later. I still live in the same house, and every day, the fear lingers, the fear of that night, the fear of his return. Story number 14. The Man in the Dark. My childhood was spent in a small house with my mother. During my middle and high school years, she took on an overnight job, leaving me alone most evenings between 8:00 p.m. and 4:00 a.m. This unsettling incident happened a few months before I graduated high school. It was a typical night, and as usual, I said goodbye to my mom around 7:30 p.m. I spent the next couple of hours immersed in video games. It was a school night, so I knew I couldn't stay up too late, but I still lingered past my bedtime. Around 11:30 p.m., I turned everything off and headed to my room. I was on my phone for another hour before finally drifting off to sleep. I woke up to the sound of a door closing downstairs. I looked at the clock on my nightstand and saw it was 3:30 a.m. I assumed my mom had simply come home early from work. I rolled over, attempting to fall back asleep, but the sound of footsteps moving around downstairs kept me awake. It was unlike my mom, who usually went straight upstairs to get ready for bed. These footsteps were aimless, meandering throughout the house. I listened intently, and as the minutes ticked by, I realized that the footsteps were moving continuously, never stopping. They were going through each room as if someone was taking a tour of the house. A wave of unease washed over me. I began to doubt if it was my mom down there. I swung my legs out of bed and turned on my room's light. The footsteps stopped immediately. I pressed my ear to my door, listening intently, but heard nothing. Cautiously, I opened the door and peered into the hallway, expecting to see light from downstairs. The house was pitch black. Whoever was down there hadn't turned on a single light. A chill ran down my spine. Carefully, I crept down the hallway, keeping silent, until I reached the top of the stairs. I knelt down, peering through the railing into the living room. No one was there, and in the darkness, it was clear nothing had been disturbed. My PlayStation was still there, a clear sign that there was no one else in the house besides my mom. If someone was here to rob us, and had walked through the whole house, They would have taken the most expensive thing in the room. All I wanted at that point was to know if it was my mom downstairs, or if I was experiencing some sort of auditory hallucination. I slowly made my way down the stairs and called out, "Mom, are you home?" There was no response, no sound of movement. I walked through the hallway to the kitchen. A shoe print on the tile floor caught my eye. When I looked up, my gaze met the silhouette of a figure across the room. A man, obscured by a dark mask and black clothing, sat at the dining table. It was difficult to make out any features. He was staring at me, but he didn't speak or move. His gaze was emotionless, unsettling. I ran back upstairs, locking myself in my room. I called 911. The operator informed me of the police's estimated arrival time, but within a minute, I heard the man slowly walk across the downstairs and toward the bottom of the stairs. I whispered to the operator, panic rising in my chest. Then, I heard the front door open and the man walking away from the house. Less than 30 seconds later, headlights shone through the window. My mom had arrived. I raced outside to meet her and tell her what had happened. When the police arrived, they conducted a thorough search, but found nothing incriminating. They couldn't locate the man. From the evidence, it seemed he wasn't interested in robbing us, nor did he seem to be targeting me. It was clear he was most likely trying to hurt or abduct my mom. His timing, entering the house only minutes before my mom usually got home, made this clear. The thought of what could have happened, if I hadn't gone downstairs to investigate, or if my mom had arrived a minute earlier, haunts me to this day. It's a chilling reminder of the danger that lurked just outside my door.